The Enlightenment, of course, affected the Jews in various ways. The Enlightenment was European, predominantly. And so it affected European Jews, mainly, in various ways. But Western European Jews responded differently than Eastern European Jews, and depending on the country that they lived in was the nature of their response. Ultimately, as a result of the Enlightenment, conservative and Reform Judaism developed as responses to needs for modernity, wanting to be able to be more engaged in modern society. And it was a major catalyst, it was a major effect, it had a major effect on modern Ashkenazi Judaism. Another major catalyst that had a profound effect on modern Ashkenazi Judaism, of course, is the Holocaust. So one could essentially say that the Holocaust and the Enlightenment were the cast, it was the crucible in which modern Ashkenazi Judaism in all of its facets were forged, they were created. So I will speak with you from the perspective of the Sephardi communities that I've had personal involvement with. And I have had personal, close involvement in two Sephardi communities. One is the Syrian community, the Halabi community in New York, in Brooklyn. I served as a rabbi in that community from the age of 24 to 39 years old. You can do the math. And the second community is the Spanish and Portuguese community of London, England, It's more than London, it's London and Manchester, but it's in England. And that community has been in England since 1656. The first synagogue they built was built in 1701 on Bevis Marks Street, and the synagogue is simply called Bevis Marks. Our official name of the community is Shara Shamayim. Nobody calls it that. They call the synagogues, we do use it, but usually we're called the S&P. That's the name of the broad community, Spanish, Portuguese. And the synagogues are called most often by the street on which they're built. So the synagogue that I am at, our flagship, our main synagogue, our largest synagogue, is called Lauderdale Road, because it's on Lauderdale Road. The old synagogue, Bevis Marks, was built in 1701. And since that day, the doors have never closed. It has been in continual use for over 350 years. It is still lit by candlelight. The benches and the furniture and all of it is the original 1701 models. Nothing's changed. There's been a bit of a refurbishment just recently, new floor panes. At one point, a choir box was put in. But you can see that already these are two very different Sephardi communities. The Brooklyn community is an Eastern community, meaning that the origins of the community are in the East, in Halab, in Aleppo, in Syria. My family, personally, I come from two Halabi families, which come from Halabi families, all the way back for at least 200 to 300 years. My whole family is Halabi. I don't have any other, And the Halabiya have been there there's portions of the community that have been there since David HaMelech. They're the Mustarab. They've been there indigenous for a very long time. And then there were, of course, the Spanish Jews that came after the 1492, the expulsion, who arrived in Halab, and they stayed separate for a very long time. They didn't mix. But eventually, gravitational forces pull, and they mixed. The Western Sephardi, the S&P in London, is Western. They were never in the East. They started in Spain and Portugal, and these particular families that started the community went from Spain and Portugal after 1492, they went to Amsterdam. And they stayed in Amsterdam for a long time. And in 1656, Oliver Cromwell was the Lord Protector of England. They had overthrown the monarchy, Charles I. And Menashe ben Israel, who was one of the head Rabbanim of Amsterdam, came to England to ask Oliver Cromwell to allow the Jews to come back into England because he wanted to give his community opportunity for greater financial success and opportunity, and in Amsterdam was getting to be very difficult. Oliver Cromwell allowed the Jews to come in unofficially, but he allowed them. And that's where my community in England began. So I've been there for 7 years as the senior rabbi, as the hacham, of the head of the community. So my job there, just to orient you, my job there is, since I'm the senior rabbi, I oversee all of the religious activities in the kahal. And in our kahal, it's a very small kahal, but it has all of the components that a kahal requires. We have, of course, the Hebra Kadisha and the Gemilut Hasadim. We have a Beit Din. We have all of these we have 4 member synagogues and 2 affiliate synagogues. We have 2 synagogues in Manchester, and various other charities and organizations in our kahal that I oversee. So these are 2 very different things, and it's funny because when my family, the Syrians, come to visit me in England, they feel like they're with Ashkenazim. Because you come into a synagogue in London, the Sephardi synagogue in London, and there's a choir, and we wear top hats. I wear a top hat every Shabbat still. I don't wear the robes anymore. We stopped that, but I wear a top hat every Shabbat. And the music is not what you would expect in an Eastern kahal. So you might hear something like Adonai Malach Geutla. You don't hear that in an Eastern thing, right? You hear Adonai Malach Geutla. Right? That's what you hear. It's different. So you come in, and my wife, when she first came into the Spanish Portuguese, she said, "It sounds like church." And I said to her, "That's because you're used to a mosque." The bottom line, right? So all of that to show that the influences of the society in which the Jews lived, it affected them. But what I want to look at with you is the effects of both the Holocaust and more specifically the Enlightenment on those communities, which for all intents and purposes, they were not touched the same way. For many of the Ashkenazim in the European cities in which they lived, they were either living in ghettos for a very long time, which meant that they were isolated by walls, literal walls, between them and the communities, the society in which they lived. And there was a very strong sense of separateness between the Jews, the Ashkenazi Jews, and the society in which they lived. They did not open themselves to study anything other than Torah for hundreds of years. They never wrote anything until Shamshin Raphael Hirsch in the 19th century. They never wrote anything in the local language of the people that they lived in. To contrast that, we were speaking yesterday about Harambam. Harambam in the 12th century, he wrote in Arabic, Judeo-Arabic, but he wrote in Arabic, right? And that was very, very common in the time. They spoke the language of the societies in which they found themselves. So when the Enlightenment occurred, when that started to come around, in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, depending on where you look back, because there are precursors to the Enlightenment. There's a scientific revolution that pushed it, that developed it forward, and various other aspects of European thought that ended up pushing things forward. The Principia of Newton and so on. And so what occurred is that society, the general society, began to think in a much more rationalistic, scientific way. And that threatened tremendously the very strong religious dominance in the Middle Ages of Europe. During the Middle Ages, arguably the most powerful man in the world was the Pope. Because every king had to bow to the Pope, right? The majority of Europe was Catholic until, of course, there were Reformations in Germany and then, of course, in England. They were very different Reformations, Henry VIII just wanted to marry Anne Boleyn. In Germany, it was much more lishma, right? It was much more, for the purpose. But what have you, during the Middle Ages, Christianity, feudal systems were very strong, order was very strong, everybody had a sense of, and so there was a dominance, there was a control that the church had over the thought and minds of the people. And they described reality. They had full control of literacy, of music. If you wanted to write music, you wrote music for the church. If you wanted to read, why do you need to read? If you need to read, you can read for the church, but otherwise, why is there? So there was gradual developments, right, through this. With the Enlightenment, all of these things started to break down. There was a sense of emancipation. There was a sense of individual freedoms. There was a sense of living through reason. And so the strength of religion started to falter. And people wanted to be able to have free lives in the societies in which they lived. And that affected the Jews. And so the Jews had a very difficult time because they were not used to integrating with the society in which they lived. This was a rupture, right? First name. Professor Soloveitchik, I'm trying to remember his first name. Chaim, thank you. Professor Chaim Soloveitchik, he wrote a very famous article in the 80s called Rupture and Reconstruction, and where he looks at the Ashkenazi developments from the Holocaust and the Enlightenment. But he calls it a rupture, right? There was a breaking of the whole sense of framework of religious life that Ashkenazi Jews had as a result of this influx of the Enlightenment. So there was, developments of emancipating, and, of course, about Mendelssohn and so on. I'm not going to go into all of that. I'm assuming either you'll Google it afterwards or you know it, yeah? But essentially, what happened was the Jews had a tremendous difficulty in reconciling their Jewish lives, their Torah lives, right, their Torah faithful lives, and the modern society in which they lived. And they felt more and more that there was a complete detachment from their capacity to be able to live in the modern society in which they found themselves and be faithful to their Torah. And this was a massive challenge, of course, to the rabbis. As how are we supposed to deal with this? This was not something that was gradual. This was not something that was engaging as a process. This was a strong rupture of what it was that they understood. So the response then was Hasidism, right, to give them some kind of spirituality and feeling of meaning and so on and so forth. What ends up happening is for 2 centuries, the Ashkenazim have to figure out how they're going to deal with this. And then the Holocaust. What the Holocaust did was completely sever any element of tradition that went from parent to child over generations. So whatever it was, whatever elements, whatever people came out of the Holocaust, they had no parents that they could speak to ask, what did we do? They had no grandparents. I mean, I remember when I was younger, one of my Ashkenazi teachers, a rabbi of mine, said, we are just now beginning to see grandparents walk down the aisle in weddings again. Right? The Sefaradim don't appreciate that properly. But, when I was young, I must have been maybe 14, 15 years old, I think, when he told me that. And I had not realized that, but of course, that for all of my friends, Ashkenazi Jews, they had no grandparents. They had no grandparents to walk down the aisle. So there was a complete severing of what Soloveitchik calls mimetic tradition. Mimetic meaning passed down, not in books, right, not written, but behavioral, right, modeled tradition, going back down. And if they wanted to, so these were 2 major tumults, right, that occurred. The Holocaust and the Enlightenment in different ways it broke down tremendously the sense of Jewish life. So what Soloveitchik suggests as far as the Ashkenazim are concerned is that what they did, the only thing that they had were textual sources. In other words, they could at least go back and read what was written and try to rebuild from that. But because there was no contextual action associated with the text, there was no context with the text, as I had mentioned before, they were left to have to define the text in however it was that they understood it. And it tended to lean to the right, to more stringent ways of reading. And that was because it felt more secure and felt more to the law. And he does this through many, many pages, and he says essentially that the reason why we are seeing in Orthodox Ashkenazi Judaism a move to the right are because of these reasons. They have to now base everything on textual definitions, and there's no context or living example of those textual definitions. And so they base it only on what the text says, and not on what they see, the behavior that they see. Yes? Okay. So it got me to think about myself. Now, I was born in Los Angeles in 1975. And I went to a Jewish day school. And I grew up in a Jewish community. Of course, the majority of the community were Ashkenazim. And whatever it was that I saw in the Jewish day school was not what I saw at home. I'll give you some examples, right? The kippah. I grew up not wearing a kippah. My father didn't wear a kippah. My grandfather was a very God-fearing man. My grandfather, he used to sit by his window. He was an older man already. He would sit by his window of his house with a book every day and learn and study and read. He was extremely careful in mitzvot. He was a devout man. He didn't wear a kippah. He used to wear a kippah. It looks like half of this, the fabric. He would put it in his pocket, and he would wear it if he said a beracha, if he had to. But everybody did that. I mentioned yesterday Chacham Matlub Abadi. Chacham Matlub Abadi, he used to work. He went to work. He worked in the city in Manhattan. He was a tremendous Talmid Chacham. He was one of the top Chachamim of our community, of the Syrian community in New York. And my father told me when he would drive him to work in the morning after Knis, after Bet Knesset, after synagogue, and he would get in the car. He would take his kippah off. The Chacham, he would take his kippah off, put it in the car. He'd go, okay, yalla, let's go. The Chachamim didn't wear kippot normal time. A kippah was not a symbol of religiosity among the Sefaradim. A kippah was a halakha. When you say God's name, you have to cover your head. So if we are eating, we cover our head. If we're studying Torah, we cover our head. That's how we did. Today, and certainly among the Ashkenazim, if you were not wearing a kippah, it was tantamount to being irreligious. It was a symbol of religiosity. So that was difficult for me because I was afraid to be caught by my rabbis not wearing a kippah, but at home nobody wore a kippah. So that's an example of mimetic tradition, yeah? And then people would point to me to the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch says a person should not walk 4 amot without a head covering. So how do you reconcile? So if I don't have behavior of my parents and to reconcile with the text, all I have is the text. And then I can't ask my father or my grandfather, how do they understand that? Right? So now I know that the Shulchan Aruch says, Lo yelech, don't walk. But it doesn't say asur lelech. It doesn't say it's prohibited to walk. And those are two very different legal terms. They're legal terms. It's a legal work like any other legal thing. Don't walk is, look, you should try to. If you want to be very devout, that's what you do. But meanwhile, all the devout people in my circle, and all of them, I grew up before, I'll get to it, there was a very strong influence of Ashkenazi yeshivot in our community. I grew up before all of that happened. I remember, I'll never forget, my grandfather, Alav Shalom Arzra Dweck, he was born in Halab, and I remember him sitting in the window, and it was just beginning that some of the members of the Kahal were now studying in Lakewood. They were going to Lakewood in the Ashkenazi community, and he saw them walking down the street in black coat and black hat, and I remember my grandfather, he had a very strong Arabic accent, Syrian accent. And he saw them walking Shabbat down the block, down the road. He said, this is not our way. It's not our way. Yeah? But that's all he said. He just saw, it's not our way. Another example. I learned when I was in school, the Hanukkah, lighting a Hanukkah. It's supposed to be by the window. Unless it's dangerous, right? Which Baruch Hashem is not dangerous. We weren't living in Los Angeles, not dangerous. It's supposed to be in the window. Shulchan Aruch, supposed to be in the window. My family, my mother's family, my father's family, they all let it in the living room on the table, inside. No? Okay. I was embarrassed to tell my teacher my family doesn't do that. I went home, I'm like, I don't think you're doing it right. Yeah? Another example, I always, in school, they would wash hands before lunch for bread. Yeah? And they were, nobody spoke, right? They say a whole conversation without talking between. In my house, we washed our hands and we spoke afterwards. I never saw that though. The first time I saw that was when I went to school and they told me not to say, and then go wash again if you spoke and say another beracha, which only later I realized is very wrong. You can't say another beracha because you're not supposed to, whatever. Well, these are examples of things that I saw in all of my community and my family, but that I was studying in school by the Ashkenazi teachers of mine, which is nothing wrong with it. It's just I didn't see it in my house. I didn't know what to do about it. I didn't know And what I realized was there were certain behaviors that were accepted as the understanding of our practice. This is how we practice. It wasn't against halakha. There were reasons for it. But it was practice that was not written down in a book, but modeled, which I only later realized I had and my Ashkenazi friends didn't. Because thank God I didn't lose my grandparents. I was very grateful and able, but they didn't have their grandparents or great-grandparents to look and see what do they do. So there was a massive severing. And what happened was, as a result of that, the Ashkenazim became very strongly attached to the text. There was a movement to the right. There was what they called modern orthodoxy that tried to develop with Yeshiva University and so on, but still this was the interesting thing, that for the Ashkenazim, modern orthodoxy is an innovation. They're trying to work it out. For the Sefaradim, there was never a question of course, you develop with the world knows. So it's interesting. So I wanted to think about how did the Enlightenment and the Holocaust affect us, both in the Eastern, in my Syrian community, and in the Spanish-Portuguese. It affected differently, but very, very interesting. So for the Eastern community, for the Syrian community, of course, the Holocaust didn't reach Syria. And so there was none of that existential change in terms of the community there. So there was a very clear and unbroken tradition that was passed on by behavior, by modeling, by being able to see what was done. The Enlightenment also didn't reach the East. Not in any significant way. There were maybe one or two Hachamim that had a sensitivity to the Enlightenment. There was some French influence from the Alliance that came into the East that affected it. But you did not have rabbis reading the Principia. You did not have rabbis that were rolling up their sleeves and getting knee-deep into the cutting-edge scientific thought and needing to reconcile of the day. Because they didn't need to. Because although it would have been interesting for them to do, the people were not aware of it. And they were living their lives just fine. They were continuing the way that they had all along. So there wasn't an imminent need to respond to these things in the East. There were some Hachamim that were aware of these things. Rabbi Yitzhak Dayan was one of them. Rabbi Israel Moshe Hazan was one of them. And even they were not deep into the cutting-edge scientific, philosophical, literary developments that were going on in the Western world at the time. They were aware of them, but they didn't need to be completely engaged with them because their kahal were not suffering from them. So when you don't have a catalyst to require an object at rest tends to stay at rest. It doesn't require the energy in order to be able to respond. So they did not have to worry about this. Until they had to leave Halab. Why did my family, most of my community in New York, leave Halab? Because of the opening of the Suez Canal in the late 19th century. Shut down. Halab was a port town, so all of their business was through the work that happened, or whatever it was, the commerce that came in through the port. When the Suez Canal opened, it shut down completely, and there was poverty. So my family and everyone around the community, they left in order to be able to find business, to be able to make money to support. And that's really why the majority of the Jews left Halab at the time, not because of persecution. It was only later that persecution occurred. So when they come into the United States, right, which is my story, what did they have themselves? They create a kahal within themselves, a very strong, powerful kahal, perhaps one of the strongest communities in the world. Not to take anything away from the very powerful community in Mexico. But that's what they did. And they did that for maybe 30, 40 years. Until the second and third generation children were feeling uncomfortable. That what it was that they had at home was not matching where the world was around them in the modern American society. I'm going to leave you there and we're going to come back to that. Okay? So let's go over here to London. Yeah? Visual change. Yeah? Let's go over here to London. What happens in London? Remember, 1656. They're Sephardim, they're Spanish and Portuguese Jews. They've never lived in a ghetto. When I went to go visit Cordoba, they wanted to show a Jewish, section of town they can't, because the Jews just lived with everybody. So they try for tourists to put Jewish stars on the floor to say there must have been a Jew here, or something like that. But there's no particular section in Cordoba or in Malaga that they say, oh, this was the Jewish area. There's no Jewish area. They lived with everybody. And they engaged with everybody. I mean, it's very famous already that Harambam is only an example, but of course it was normal practice for people like Rabbi Yehuda Levi and Shalom ibn Gabirol and of course Harambam. Harambam didn't like poetry for other reasons, but let's say Shalom ibn Gabirol as one of them, one of the most famous Spanish poets, although he was only one of many. They listened to Spanish poetry and Spanish song, and they took the entire thing and they became experts in the craft, and they put Hebrew words to it. Some of the most amazing poetry that we have in the Jewish repertoire is written by the Sephardi poets. I was once sitting with Rabbi Sachs, Lava Shalom, and he said, Rabbi Dweck, you have the most beautiful poems in your liturgy. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Achare Ratzon, and El Nor Alila, and Ya Shemai Bionecha. We have the most unbelievable poems, the most soaring things. He goes, you have such wonderful poems. He goes, and all we have is like these crossword puzzles that we say, they lived in the society, and we're going back all the way till the 12th, 11th century. It was normal to read what it was that was being written in the world, to study what was being studied in the world, to engage in the art that was being worked in the world, and to incorporate it. What the Jews did in Spain and Portugal, essentially in the Iberian Peninsula, is they lived in a framework of Jewish thought, of Jewish ideals, and they assimilated, they incorporated elements within that framework. And it enhanced it. But they didn't live in the outside and put some Jewish ideas. There's a very big difference. Yeah? So for them, these Jews that now came out, which many of them were conversos by the end, right? Many of them conversos, are living now in London. Hacham, my predecessor, Hacham David Nieto, he was the first Hacham of the community after the synagogue was built in 1701. Hacham David Nieto was a polymath. He was a philosopher, he was a doctor, he was a scientist, he was very well versed in all those things. He wrote a book, among others, called Mate Dan. Dan is David Nieto. Dan Del David Nieto, right? Mate Dan, to secure and support rabbinic Judaism. Because his constituents in the Kahal, they were fine with the Mosaic law, right? The Bible, they were Christian, but the rabbis, they didn't know. So he had to write and encourage them and teach them and so on. So they were very used to being in the world and the thought. So during the time of the Enlightenment, which essentially was a time during Chacham David Nieto, it was during his time, and David Nieto spoke with the Archbishop of Canterbury, he had writings between him and the others, he was always involved. They were very used to this, so this wasn't a rupture. Even for the Western Sefaradim, they were used to hearing these things. And they thankfully had Hachamim that were also used to hearing these things. And the Hachamim in the West, there were Western Sefaradim. I consider Italy to be essentially in the West. Many of the Hachamim came from Italy. Chacham David Nieto was from Livorno. Yeah, they were used. There was a university in Padua. They were used to studying these things and learning these things. Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, who was born in 1701, right? Chacham David Nieto is 1683, and dies in 1720 something. Chacham Moshe Luzzatto, he was a playwright. He was one of a great Chacham, but he also wrote plays. He wrote 3 morality plays. Why did he do that? Because he wanted to use the modern mode of speaking to the people to teach at the time. That's what he did. So for the Sefaradim in the West, who were experiencing the Enlightenment, the experience for them was very different than the Ashkenazim who were experiencing the Enlightenment, which was much more stark and much more shocking. So in England, the Sefaradim established their kahal. They carried on with their lives. They worked in the city, right? They worked and engaged in the English society. They tried to be very English because they want to blend, yeah? And they carried on fine. And they had great hachamim, and they built a strong community, and all of that was carrying on very well. Looked at the Sefaradim who came from Halab, who's Newton, right? I'll give you an example. There's a story that they tell about Hacham Avadia Yosef, my wife's grandfather. Zecher Tzadik Livracha. He was like this. He didn't study science. He studied Torah. That was his focus, yeah? And he grew up in Eretz Israel. From 4 years old, he was born in Iraq, in Baghdad. He moved at 4 years old to Eretz Israel. He never left that area. So, but he had encyclopedic knowledge of Jewish law. He was one of the most prolific scholars of Jewish law in the last 200 years. So he was sitting once with Rav Aaron Lichtenstein. Rav Aaron Lichtenstein was originally an American rabbi around the YU movement, also brilliant man, but he had studied everything. He studied philosophy and literature and science. And they found themselves together at some event. And Rav Lichtenstein gets up and he says, I want to speak. He opens up talking about the Russian thinker Dostoevsky. And Hacham Ovadia is sitting there and he turns to the person next to him. He goes, I'll say it in Hebrew and then I'll translate it. He says, Ani makir kol posek Rusi. I know every Russian scholar, rabbi. Ve'en echad b'shem Dostoevsky. There's not one named Dostoevsky. But that's what happened. Yeah. So what did they didn't know from these things? Maybe the very well read, those who went to the Alliance, right? In Halab, incidentally, they didn't allow the boys to go to the Alliance. Different than Egypt. In Halab, they were very strict. They allowed the girls. My grandmother, she spoke French, Aliyah Shalom. She went to the Alliance. She read novels. She had a better awareness. The boys were not allowed to go to the Alliance. They didn't go. They studied Torah. To the yeshiva, to the kitab or to the yeshiva, whatever it is. So when they came to the United States, they were not aware of these things. And the younger generations began to feel self-conscious that they were missing something. So when you are now think about this, right? Not only is this a thing that they've lost in terms of the enlightenment that the Ashkenazim had that they don't. The Ashkenazim had lived in the West for 1,000 years. So Western culture was in their fiber. It was very much part of who they were, how they saw the world. The Sefaradim were in the East. So that in and of itself is a massive shift of paradigm. What is the Western world? So they had to, and they had to be able to learn how to engage with the West. And what is the natural tendency to do? First of all, if you feel self-conscious from your own people, right? Other Jews, and you realize that they have a knack, they have an edge, because they've been, yes, America was the new country for everybody. Yeah, it was the new world for everybody. But it was Western. It wasn't Eastern. And so the Ashkenazim were coming from the old world, was still coming from a much more familiar world than the ones who were coming from Halab. So if I have to look now to what should I do in this place, where do I look to? I look to my brothers, the Ashkenazim, who have a better understanding of Western society. And they looked at these Sefaradim as being uneducated, unsophisticated, uncouth, which was not necessarily true. But they were not fitting well into where it was that Western. So because, for all intents and purposes, the average person in Syria, and for that matter, many of the Western countries, there were differences, right? Egypt was much more, secular than those who were living in Halab. Iraq, they were very, very interested in education, higher education. But for all intents and purposes, it was very much the same. The East was not on par in the same place around where the Western world was, like everyone else. So what happened as a result of that? Because of self-consciousness, there was a strong tendency to say, they know what they're doing and we don't. Meaning the Ashkenazim know what they're doing, we don't. And they looked at their grandparents, not in a bad way, but they looked at their grandparents, you can't give me what I need. So, on the religious level, there were also no yeshivot that were Sephardi yeshivot that taught. Because think about it, also, the Syrian Jews were not encouraging their children to become teachers. Of course not. They needed to go to business. Who's going to go? You're going to go be a teacher? They weren't encouraging them to become rabbis. They weren't thinking, I'm going to open a yeshiva. Even when they did open the first yeshiva, Magen David, my father, Alav Shalom, was the first class of Magen David yeshiva in Brooklyn. They were against opening the yeshiva. They're going to say it's going to separate us too much from the society and so on. They wanted to be Americans. They wanted very much to be Americans. So they didn't have any place to go. So where did they go? Lakewood. And that's where they learned. And then when they came home and they saw that my father doesn't wear a kippah, he's lighting the Hanukkah in the living room. They don't know anything. I learned from the Gemara. I learned from the Shulchan Aruch. And you're doing it wrong. And that began a big shift. Because they looked and said, they know what they're doing. They've been living in the West for 1,000 years. They went through the Enlightenment. They also looked, they were more attractive. And they didn't have the resource. And so what that caused was a moving to the right and an introduction, because of a self-consciousness, of not being able to say, yeah, I light the Hanukkah in my living room, and there's a reason why we do it. And if you don't like it, too bad. And I do speak after I wash Netilat Yadayim, because that's what my family does. And they didn't necessarily know how to explain it, but of course, but my grandparents don't know what they're doing. We didn't have Hachamim. So there was a big shift. And because of that, self-consciousness, there was the Torah was taken over essentially by Ashkenazi teaching, and Sephardi teachers began to teach like Ashkenazi. And that was a big issue. And much of that was because of the sidelining that we had with the whole nature of where it was that the West went. Now, if you come over here, what's going on in London at the time? The Spanish Portuguese don't care about the Ashkenazim or what's going on. Why? Because the Spanish Portuguese were the first Jews in England. So they were the establishment, which is very rare. But the Sefaradim were the establishment. In Bevis Marks, you can still see, if you come visit, I'll show you. Let me know when you come, I'll give you a tour. There's still the benches, there's low benches, right? Normally you sit in, they're not comfortable, but you sit in wooden seats, There were benches that were on the sides of the Bet Knesset in the back. That's where the Ashkenazim sat. They made the Ashkenazim sit there. They weren't allowed to sit in you're not allowed to marry Ashkenazim. Sir Moses Montefiore, who was the president of the Kahal at the turn of the century, the 20th century, he would give a double dowry to a girl or a boy who would marry an Ashkenazi. And the reason he did that, because he felt there was too much intermarriage in the Kahal. He wanted them to be more integrated with the Ashkenazim. The Ashkenazim came about 100 years after us in England. Yeah? They had to follow us, not the other way around. So we weren't worried about that. And we carried on. And they had to follow. They wanted to be like us. So we set the tenor, we set the tone for religious life in England. As the Ashkenazim started to become more religious, and how did that happen? That happened because of relatively recently, because of communication. So they wanted to be more like American Ashkenazi Jews. They wanted to go and study in the same yeshivot. But for a very, very, very long time, the nature of Orthodox Judaism in England was set by the Spanish Portuguese, and it was very moderate. Very moderate. Only recently it became much more religious. When they started to become much more religious, they looked at us as maybe being a bit conservative, we didn't care, because we always did our own thing. You don't like us, we sit at every table of the community, we're the founders of the community, we don't have to do what you like. They used to call themselves, some people still do, they used to call themselves, the Sefaradim would call themselves the aristocracy of British Jewry. Yeah, they literally they treated themselves that way. Okay, whatever you like. It's not noisy. Little by little, though, because of that, and because they were neither touched by the Holocaust, remember, the Holocaust wasn't Churchill, right? So that's an amazing thing, because England was not touched. To the contrary, it's the only country that rose in population after the war, in Jewish population after the war, because people sent their children to England in the kinder transport to be saved. So the Ashkenazim also never broke in England. So there's a very strong, what they call minhag Anglia. Minhag Anglia, among the Ashkenazim, they have an old kahal tradition of what's the minhag in England that was never broken. And the Sefaradim were able to carry on for 300 years. But what happened as a result of that, very interestingly, in my kahal, there's maybe, I would say, and this is a very, very generous estimate, maybe 10 to 15% of the kahal are still the old Spanish and Portuguese families. So I do have families in my kahal, the Rodriguez Pereiras and the Mendozas and the Pereiras and the Herreras and the Gomez de Costas. We have all of these families in our kahal that are there for 10 generations. Their great-great-grandparents got married in the same synagogue, in the same synagogue, in the same synagogue. Yeah? It's unbelievable. But there may be 10, 15%. What happened to everybody else? There's tons of families that don't exist anymore. The Lindos and the Perez's, there's a whole bunch of families. We don't have them anymore. Why? They intermarried. They were so engaged in society and so easily involved in society that they intermarried. And there was nothing holding them back from doing that. So why do I have a kahal now? Because the Iraqi Jews left in the 60s and the 50s and they came to England. They became part of the kahal. And they took the minhagim of the Spanish Portuguese, which is funny when you hear an Iraqi guy speaking Spanish Portuguese. So, to close, and then I'll open for questions. That, for all intents and purposes, again, in very broad strokes, is where we find ourselves. Because for the Eastern Sephardi Jews, I didn't speak about Israel, right? But Israel, you can imagine, all you have to do is plant the same concept, right? So when you have Syrian Jews, Iraqi Jews, Egyptian Jews coming into a modern Israeli state that is run by Ashkenazim, both religious and otherwise, right? I'm not just talking about the secular Ashkenazim that started the state. The yeshivot that were started in Israel were made by who? Ashkenazis. So the Sefaradim were looked at as unsophisticated, uneducated. And so what they wanted to do as a result of that was to belong. So they dressed like them. And they went to the yeshivot. And they spoke like them. Because they didn't have any other options. There was no one else that was teaching them, you don't have to be self-conscious. And yes, we can learn and understand, and we have our way of doing it. It wasn't taught. And so I think, well, how different could it be? You go to yeshiva, you study Torah. How different could it be? It was very different. And so we find ourselves in a situation now in where what was a tradition that was passed on is now not held in many areas because of that problem. And for the Western Sfaradim, they carry on, but they have no kahal left. And so they are also beginning to feel self-conscious. Now that they're looking around and where is everybody left? They're all gone, and maybe we should start getting a little bit more religious. So that's why at this point in my kahal, I started, during COVID, I started an online bit midrash that teaches the classical Sephardi approach that we don't talk about anymore because it's been so dominated by the Ashkenazi way of learning. I called it the Habura. My student Sinakai, and he did it together with me. He's amazing how much he's worked to be able to develop. It's all his work, really. Yeah. But I'm doing that from my auspices in the S&P Kahal because I wanted to be able to put out into the world, we have our way. And we have a derech. And it's old. And we need to be able to teach that again. And I'm glad to see that we put it out there, and there's over 300 students. Some of them are sitting here, actually. There's over 300 students around the world that are interested in learning what's their derech for them, that really isn't being taught. And so thankfully we have an ability to not worry about geographical things. It's online, so everybody can see it. But that's where we are, where we find ourselves today. And so we're at a point where we might not be able to preserve and to develop, our way in the derech that was passed down from generation to generation, but I think that we have an opportunity to. And I hate to say it this way, but we're an endangered species. Because if we don't do something, it's only a matter of time that it won't be around anymore. And it's just the way the nature of things went, right? So unfortunately, it's only when a species is endangered that everybody wants to save it, right? They kill it until... But now, so I hope that it won't remain that way, but I consider it right now to be an endangered species. What our Sephardi approach that came from Sepharad, that was, given over generation after generation, that for the reasons, again, very broadly that I explained, was threatened. And yeah, so that's where I think we find ourselves now. So it just requires dealing with it. If you look at Judaism as this monolithic, parochial, like very narrow, predefined thing, which is not what it is, then of course you don't set it up for success, because there's nowhere to move. But it doesn't need to be that way.